Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, or good morning for everyone who's joining us tonight from all around the world. We have about registration from 18 countries, most of the GCC countries, Middle East, most of European countries, North America, and some countries from Far East. We are delighted to have you all with us tonight, and welcome to the Kuwait Hydrogen Seminar under the theme of Transition Towards Zero Emission Hydrocarbons. Please note the seminar will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel and LinkedIn within a few days. My name is Salman Al-Hajraf, and I am founder and CEO of Idama Consult, a Kuwaiti consultancy company focused on the three pillars of energy transition era: hydrogen, carbon, and renewable energy technologies. As you know, energy supply, demand, energy resources, energy security, energy sustainability, and many other terms that every nation trying to satisfy for their own national security from their own national security prospect. During peace times, energy supply and demand is used as a commodity for cross-nation economic development. And unfortunately, during war times, it is used as a card to show strength from both sides, producers and consumers, depending on who gets hurt most. And in my opinion, both sides get hurted if we use energy as a tool in such conflicts. Having this dilemma, moving forward and backward over decades, hydrogen as a buzzword to solve the energy puzzle, rise, but then fall in many times due to many reasons, including economics, technology maturity, or lack of policy support. Recently, hydrogen as a clean fuel and sometimes, or energy carrier on other times, became the life jacket for many nations, policymakers, environment activists, national and international energy industries. Today and during the current round of hydrogen rise, we can say with confidence that the world entering into a colorful race for hydrogen economy, green, blue, turquoise, or many other colors, first to become early arrivals to zero emission strategies, and more importantly, to solve the energy supply security issues that rise during conflict times like what we are witnessing over the past few weeks, unfortunately. The world today developing multi-billion projects of hydrogen production throughout hydrogen supply chain, including production, storage, transportation, and utilization. In 2020, the global hydrogen production was around 70 metric million tons. That is about 76% from natural gas using steam methane reforming, and 22% from coal gasification, mainly from China, and around 2% only from electrolyzer, or what we can call it, the green hydrogen. With many projections and scenarios to reach different levels, depending on the scenarios for 2030 and beyond. Tonight, we will be focusing on the production side only and explore the challenges and opportunities from the point of view of oil-dependent country like Kuwait. Both hydrocarbons-based and water-based hydrogen will be covered by our guest speakers. With this small introduction, I would like to welcome you again from Kuwait for this short seminar and welcoming our speakers, Mr. Anar Aliyev, President of PP Kuwait and Qatar, and Dr. Manal Shihabi, Founding Director, Shear Research and Advisory from UK. Let us start with our first speaker, Mr. Aliyev. Mr. Aliyev is a member of BP Middle East Regional Leadership Team. He was appointed President of BP Kuwait and Qatar in October 2020. He has been a resident in Kuwait since 2016. His prior role including Chief of Staff for BP in the Middle East and Enhanced Technical Service Agreements, Finance Manager. Mr. Aliyev joined BP in 2005 and has held various commercial and leadership roles in BP. Our second speaker, Dr. Manal Shihabi. She is an applied economist with recognized expertise in economic modeling and policy analysis on energy, economic, and resource sustainability, focusing on the Middle East and North Africa. She is the founding director of Shear Research and Advisory Limited in the UK and an academic visitor at St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. She is also a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and research associate of the Middle East's Economic Research Forum. We'd like to welcome you both, our speakers, Dr. Shihabi and Mr. Aliyev. And I will hand over the floor to you, Mr. Aliyev, to start with your presentation with the title of BP Strategic Directions for Blue Hydrogen Productions. So please, Mr. Aliyev, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Salim. Let me just share my screen to make sure that everybody can see my screen just for a second. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, fantastic. Yes. Thank you very much. So thank you, Dr. Salim, and the distinguished guests for the opportunity to discuss energy transition, BP strategy, hydrogen ambitions. But before I start, I would like to congratulate all the female ladies in the call with the 8th of March International Women's Day, including my dear friend, Dr. Manal. And this virtual seminar is happening in Kuwait. So I would just like to highlight that BP has a very long partnership and collaboration with Kuwait, and one that we're very proud and grateful for. It's a privilege to provide support to Kuwait's most strategic assets. We're entrusted to support Greater Burgan field and the Mega Al-Zour refinery. So it's a great privilege to be in Kuwait and support this and continue our long and strategic partnership. Again, Dr. Salim, I would like to thank you for organizing this event. Great opportunity to share, our thoughts on energy transition. And of course, I will have a few slides to promote the discussion, and then I'll be open to questions and comments. So thank you. With that, I would like to start with my first slide. I mean, the first two slides has nothing to do with hydrogen, but it is important just to show the BP scale and the footprint. Then I'll quickly talk about BP strategy, and then we'll segue to hydrogen. And what is our hydrogen strategy? We'll cover a little bit on from BP economic outlook on the view of the hydrogen, and then we'll finish my presentation with 2-minute video, if internet obviously allows us that happen. So just on the first two slides. First slide is the scale of BP. We are in 70 countries. We are producing around 2.5 million barrels, close to what Kuwait produces, maybe slightly lower, and we are generating around $20 billion of operating cash flow. Our footprint on the next slide, you'll see, we have upstream oil and gas production, refineries, and the terminals and pipelines almost across the whole world. And one of the reasons I have these two slides is just actually show that, that a long-term strategic relationship can help you to build the new low carbon energy businesses. And the great examples we have, just recently this year, we signed a strategic framework agreement with in Oman, to develop renewables and hydrogen. And last year we signed an agreement with Abu Dhabi, with Masdar and ADNOC to develop the renewables and the hydrogen. So in UAE, agreements cover around 2 gigawatts of hydrogen development, 1 gigawatt in UAE and 1 gigawatt in UK area called Teesside. Potentially there could be an investment, that foreign investor first time to join us in that project. And I'll cover that details in a little bit in more detail further in my presentation. So going to the next slide, BP last year in end of 2020, we've embarked on a new strategy, and it's probably the most radical transformation in 100 years history of BP. And there is a compelling evidence that there is a finite carbon budget, and the people want to use their energy to be affordable, reliable, and clean. And we recognize that change is needed, and we are adapting to play our part. So, we're not doing it just because it is a right thing to do, but it's also a smart thing to do. Energy transition is expected to require 4 trillion investment per year, and this creates a significant business opportunity. So we began this chapter with new corporate purpose and aim to become net zero and help world to become to get to net zero. And then we've developed, based on this, our complete new strategy, restructured the entire company, reset our financial framework and investment plans. So this is basically the new strategy, BP's new strategy. It has 3 core focus areas in the vertical of this slide. First is low carbon electricity and energy, which includes low carbon electricity, integrated gas, bioenergy, and hydrogen and the CCUS, which is the topic of our discussion today. The second pillar is convenience and mobility, advancing growth market, redefining convenience and next generation mobility. And of course, the key is resilient hydrocarbons. I think resilient hydrocarbons will help us to transform. Basically, the revenues and the cash we receive from resilient hydrocarbons will help us to move into the next stage of low carbon investment opportunities. So it's very important part of our strategy. And today we see the prices of oil. It's around $120. So, and then we have the horizontals, integration, partnership, and driving digital and innovation, which is very important these days. So we believe that this strategy will help us to grow low carbon energy opportunities in the next decade to come. On the next slide, this is one of the focus areas called low carbon energy, and you will see that on low carbon energy focus area, we have an ambition to grow to 50 gigawatt renewables, and on hydrogen, intention is to capture 10% of the market share in core markets. And I will talk a little bit more on the net zero Teesside, obviously develop integrated gas and the bioenergy. So just before I move to hydrogen and how we're planning to share, capture 10% of the share in the core market, I would like to just briefly talk about 2 slides, and this is developed by our economics team, BP Energy Outlook team. Every year we issue the BP Energy Outlook, and the one for 2021 is supposed to be released on 18th of March. I will encourage to visit BP website and look for the latest update. But what does Energy Outlook shows us, BP Energy Outlook? So there are, if you see on the slide, there are 2 charts. One is about hydrogen used by sector and hydrogen used by the region. And there are 2 scenarios. One scenario is called rapid scenario, and one is called net zero. This is the terminologies defined by BP Energy Outlook team. The first one, rapid scenario, assumes that energy use will fall, emissions, basically carbon emissions used in energy will fall by 70%, and net zero assumes it's going to fall around 95%. And what we see on these slides, basically we see that the use of energy as an energy carrier increases significantly in both scenarios as world transitions to low carbon energy. And what we also see is, around 7% of total energy will comprise hydrogen in the rapid scenario, and the net zero scenario it's around 16%. And hydrogen complements the growing role of electricity because it can be used for some other activities which are different or costly or electrified, or it can be easily stored in electricity. And you see that the role of China, if you go to the regions, it's one of the biggest users and developers of hydrogen. Now, if you move to the next slide, in the next slide, we see the hydrogen production by type. And here you basically see that it will be dominated by mainly green and blue hydrogen. And the green, as you know, the green hydrogen is made of the electrolysis using renewable energy. Blue hydrogen extracted from natural gas or coal, and then displaced carbon captured and stored, CCUS, which is, for blue hydrogen, CCUS is very important. So that's you can easily see that it is significantly increasing between 2035 and 2050. The way we see it in our strategy for hydrogen, that roughly by 2035 will be around 120 million tons per annum. By 2050 we expect it to be around 320 million. So that as mentioned, generates around 17% of the total energy by hydrogen. It will be dominated mainly by in the industrial sector and the transportation sector, and globally it's spread across China, US, Europe, and so if you look at this slide, you'll see that we have existing capabilities mainly in refineries, and then we are a new market that we're looking is power industry and transport, and eventually we're trying to capture 10% of the market share. Evolution of full cost of supply will drive this growth to be initially local, then regional, and only develop to global markets by 2040. And the cost will also favor blue hydrogen, where you have a gas feedstock and the CCS capability. And we expect that parity will reach between blue and green around 2040. And as I mentioned, hydrogen complements our existing business and capabilities. Green hydrogen is adjacency to our gross renewable, and the blue hydrogen is enabled by the scale of carbon capture and storage. And obviously, the growth in this area will depend on the policies, supportive policies and technologies, and the customer choice, of course. And also we are building new partnerships in this space, for example, net zero T-side, I'll cover a little bit more, and obviously investing in new technologies. Our key focus is to build our position in both green and blue hydrogen, US, UK, Europe, China, as well as Australia. But actually, we've done a lot in the Middle East as well. And I think Dr. Manal will also talk a little bit more on the Middle East and specifically in Kuwait. But there are great opportunities, and there's a compelling story across each country, including Kuwait, to develop renewables and develop the hydrogen. Currently, if you see the progress since our set of the strategy, we made good progress on decarbonization of our refineries. We have partnership in Lingen, and we're also working to decarbonize the port of Rotterdam. And also net zero T-side offers the potential to establish clean energy industrial cluster, a first in the world, and includes opportunities to integrate hydrogen with power, industry, and transport. And mentioned hydrogen can achieve nearly 20% of final energy consumption by 2050. So it's a great, huge opportunity there. And as an example on this is net zero T-side has a part called H2 T-side, which is the hydrogen T-side, and then we have the green T-side. So what the H2 site is, we are aiming to produce around 1 gigawatt by 2027. And so UK has a target of 5 gigawatt by 2030. That's around 20% of it. And this is also, you know, if you capture and storage that, it's around 2 million tons of CO2, and it's equivalent to around heating 1 million UK households. So it's huge. That's in a nutshell what I wanted to cover, Dr. Salim, and I would like to play the video unless there are any questions for me.
Thank you, Mr. Aliyev. We can postpone questions after the presentation.
Okay.
Both presentations.
So let me just share my screen then and share that video. It's only 2 minutes short video on the T side. Hopefully it will work.
Teesside's industrial heritage goes back not just decades, but centuries to iron making and steel making, and more recently as Europe's first integrated modern chemical plant. We are the second largest carbon emitting region in the country, and that means unless we reduce our carbon footprint in a measured and sensible way, we could see the loss of many, many hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs.
The Net Zero Teesside project will impact the UK because it's the first industrial cluster, the first time anywhere on the globe that we'll be able to say we have a zero carbon production industrial cluster. Teesside is a fantastic place to decarbonise the industry. It's relatively compact, it's near a range of offshore stores. In addition to that, there's a very proud industrial heritage in Teesside, and it revitalise the economy here by taking it back to where the industry first started and learning how to do low carbon industry.
Being a part of the Net Zero Teesside project, to me, means being part of the solution towards climate change, particularly industrial decarbonisation and also decarbonised power.
To make Teesside the centre of a world-leading project like this would mean it would create new jobs, it would protect existing jobs, and it would create a platform for new and innovative technologies in the 21st century, not seen in this area for many decades.
Thank you. That was a video, Dr.
Thank you, Mr. Aliyev. I just want to remind our guests that if you have any question, you can post it in the Q&A section. Then we can go over it after the second presentation. Now I will give the floor to Dr. Shihabi. Dr. Shihabi recently published very good research paper about utilization of green hydrogen from Kuwait. I'm sure she will give us some highlights about her findings. So Dr. Shihabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salim, and hello to everybody. It's my pleasure to be with you, regardless of where you are, and good evening or good morning. And thank you, my dear friend, Mr. Aliyev, for the congratulations on International Women's Day. I hope that's a wonderful day for everybody and a celebration of all women everywhere in their different capacities. I also have a presentation for you that I'd like to share. So I will be sharing my slides. And what I would like to focus on the slide is really build on the previous presentation, but really focus on just the context, again, of production and also in Kuwait. Here we go. All right. So you should be seeing my slide now. So the question for my presentation, if there is one question to identify, is whether there really is a comparative advantage for green hydrogen production in Kuwait. So I would like to just kind of walk you through a little bit of what to consider in terms of not just the research that with the paper that I mentioned that Dr. Salim had just mentioned to you, but also what does this mean in the larger strategy, so to speak, and energy and economic transition for Kuwait and evidently for the region. So just to kind of build on a little bit what we heard Mr. Elliott said in the earlier presentation, I think a lot of the attendees are already familiar with some of the common production paths and uses of hydrogen, and I don't want to describe them in detail, but happy to elaborate if anyone has questions later. But we know that there's already a lot of hydrogen currently produced and used. The Middle East itself is one, I think, the second largest user currently of hydrogen. And I'm trying to see if I can find, there we go, the laser pointer. But most of it comes obviously from fossil fuel production because it's hydrocarbons. We can separate hydro from hydrogen from carbons, which is carbon. But then obviously that's the one that emits a lot of carbon to the atmosphere. So with CCUS, as we heard earlier, then that kind of becomes blue hydrogen, or then there is using renewable and electrolysis, and that would be the green hydrogen. And this is where I'm going to focus on a little bit more today in this presentation. But the key advantage of it as hydrogen is the various versatility and different, I think Dr. Salim kind of summarized most of the advantages of hydrogen in the energy context at the beginning of the presentation. But for a place like Kuwait and obviously all the regions all the countries in the region, the big focus is obviously the export market, because as we go into a net zero world and hydrocarbon exports are looking at that they would be going down, and what would be alternative sources of exports. And this is where there's a large interest from the Gulf states in general, as well as potentially in Kuwait. But it could also really have advantages also in local consumption, and whether it's in transport or cooling and heating. Obviously ammonia and fertilizers is a big use, but really as well in electricity or storage. It could also then complement any energy transition or decarbonization projects in the region as well. And obviously that requires carbon capture and utilization and storage technologies. But I think the focus, when we think of hydrogen in the global sense, this is the main role that it could offer. In terms of where strategies have been, most of the strategies that have been adopted globally been not in the Gulf. The Gulf has kind of been really following the rest of the world slightly at a slower pace and trying to catch up, in my opinion. And there have been large projects and large ambitions, both for blue and green, but only in the Middle East, we see obviously the Gulf oil producers, whether it's Oman or Saudi Arabia, of course, the Emirates, Kuwait, also Egypt and Morocco, but also other parts of the world like Chile, Australia, Canada, in Europe. There's lots of potential competition that the Gulf states and Kuwait would have to face. And these are, when I talk about strategies, these are national strategies by governments. Then there's also, of course, private sector and energy players like BP, for example, that has its own project that could spread across the world. So then what does this mean really in terms of is this an opportunity then for the Gulf? Obviously, there's a lot of advantages, but also challenges that have to be considered in the production side. And I won't focus so much on them, just to give you an idea in terms of, for example, transportation, or the fact that it's very flammable. So there has to be security and more safety structures in the storage and the transportation of hydrogen. So there's lots of, not just how do we produce it and separate it from either water through electrolysis or hydrocarbons in a blue hydrogen, but also then how do we transport it, and also how do we make sure that it's safe, and these other challenges that come in the production aspect as well. Of course, because the Gulf states have already a very big comparative advantage in oil and gas, we know that there would be comparative advantage in blue hydrogen, with some states have already been kind of, Aramco, for example, already had exported blue ammonia, which is a derivative of hydrogen. So the hydrogen is in the ammonia itself. And then it exported that to Japan. The first shipment was in 2020. Yes, in 2020. So that we already know that there is advantages of, or comparative advantage of that in the Gulf states, and there is that needs the carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, but also how do we store it in the ground? The Gulf states have oil fields that then could be used for storing carbon. I don't want to focus so much on that, but I just want to move from that to obviously green, because green then, if there is going to be a comparative advantage, it's not just going to be a comparative advantage with respect to the rest of the world, but also a comparative advantage vis-a-vis blue. So can we produce green hydrogen at a cheaper cost than blue? And at the earlier presentation, Mr. Eliav said that there would be parity between the prices in 2040. So then the question then becomes, could then the Gulf and Kuwait have a comparative advantage until then in green and the green energy, in the green hydrogen market? And there is a great potential comparative advantage in the Gulf, because we know that there is very good, if not, actually, I should not say very good, I should say excellent solar power resources, and of course wind resources in the Gulf, but the projects are still behind many other regions, and also behind the plans that these countries have for their own energy diversification or energy economic diversification plans. So there is still room to go, even if there is comparative advantage, and that's why I call it potential comparative advantage and not just comparative advantage. But if you were to ask in terms of market size that we have heard, is there really within that market size, can we realize this comparative advantage, and then can we then have a share of it, we being Kuwait and countries in the region? This is based on estimates that I have, not in the paper that Dr. Salem had referenced, but in another paper where I looked at, of course, there's currently various estimates of what hydrogen share could be of total energy demand globally, but it's estimated between this is up to 2050, and I apologize, the slide doesn't say that, but anywhere from 13 to 27%, which then potentially we could, if we think of a price that is comparative of with fossil fuels, so $1.5 to $2 a kilogram of hydrogen, which should be competitive with fossil fuels, that could give us anywhere from 400 to 700 billion US dollars of hydrogen and derivatives, which is the other products that could store hydrogen in them, or could be cracked to get hydrogen out of them, like ammonia. And from my estimates, when I did my analysis, I think there's a potential market there anywhere from 70 to 200 billion for Gulf states. This is quite large. And this could potentially mean the largest single region share of the world market. But again, there are significant things that we need to get to before we can achieve that realization. And at the moment, there is some blue hydrogen that could be produced at 1.5 to 2.5 US dollars per kilogram. So that's where green hydrogen would be competing with that price. Finally, for the introduction, I'm not going to discuss this much, but basically this is a table from levelized cost of green hydrogen, particularly from renewables, across the different regions and the different technologies, whether it's solar or wind. And basically the Middle East shows to be more, at the moment, not the most competitive, but in the future will be one of the most competitive estimates. But it's just kind of taking in general for the region as a whole. But I think that if we compare, while there is this competitive advantage or potential comparative advantage, the actual competitiveness that the Middle East has is still uncertain if we compare it with some of the other regions that have really large projects, but also really rich resources. And we also, achieving that comparative advantage is not just about production cost. And this is one key takeaway that I'd like those who are attending this event to remember, that there is the production cost that is extremely important, but then also there are other things that would help realize this potential comparative advantage. Why are we looking at hydrogen in Kuwait? We know that there is a need for economic and energy diversification in the context of the new Kuwait energy in 2035. Obviously, also the world I mentioned already is there's push to reduce for the energy transition away from fossil fuels. So this is an alternative potential export market as well. What has been done in terms of hydrogen, I will leave Dr. Salim to potentially comment more on this based on his experience, but just fair to say that there has been already some work on the role of hydrogen in the energy transition, with Qasr having earned a patent on enhancing magnesium to hydrogen storage for use in fuel cells. So there is some movement there. There was the white paper by KFS on hydrogen strategy in Kuwait, which Dr. Salim had mentioned, and I had the privilege to be one of the reviewers of that strategy on behalf of one of the reviewers from the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies as well. But then there's no projects that have followed. It's still kind of in the strategy phase, unlike some of the other GCC states. And what I want to present to you is more on the economic assessment, because that's the first, in my opinion, the first step in kind of achieving that hydrogen strategy. What is the economic assessment of the price? What are the appropriate markets? And how do we can we do it profitably as well? And then finally, I'm looking at green hydrogen, even though there is no production and no projects at the moment, largely because blue hydrogen, including in the white paper on the hydrogen strategy, was listed as not necessarily in the foreseeable future as part of the hydrogen plan in Kuwait. It would require really using, there's not enough, Kuwait is an importer of gas currently, so that cannot be a source for blue hydrogen, but there are other things that would require the use of oil, basically, which I'm not going to comment on, but that looks to be unlikely. So the thinking was, let's look at green hydrogen at the moment. Most of the big projects in the region are also green hydrogen. In terms of trying to estimate what production costs would be for green hydrogen, this would tell us whether, in Kuwait, this would tell us whether there is this comparative advantage. Many of you know that there is the Shagaya Renewable Energy Park in Kuwait in the western region, which has excellent wind and excellent solar sources. And at the moment, it's a little bit behind schedule in terms of the development of the project. Phase 1 has been implemented, but phase 2 is still behind schedule. But the goal is to have 4 gigawatts of electricity by 2030, and that would be 15% of electric capacity in the country from renewable energy. Now, this will be really, obviously, the main source if hydrogen were to be produced. So I don't want to talk much about the renewable energy side of things, other than renewable obviously is it is the feedstock, so to speak, of the energy source for green hydrogen to be produced. But also, once we have the Shagaya renewable project implemented, then there would be other things that would need to be implemented to ensure basically the best capacity factor for electrolyzers and being able to reduce the cost as well. So I'm not going to talk much about that. I just wanted to put that out there as a caveat in the work. So let me tell you what we did then to estimate this production cost. So this is the paper that I produced with my colleague Bassam Dali, who we did a combined technical and economic analysis of different aspects of hydrogen production in Kuwait. And Dr. Dali is an engineer by training, so he also contributed on the technology side along with my economic expertise on the matter. And we looked at the levelized cost of producing hydrogen from 2 technologies, the PEM, or the polymer electrolyte membrane, and the SOEC, which is solid oxide electrolysis cells. But in the production, and when we put the model, we assumed that there would be actual production of Shagaya by 2030, and then we can produce hydrogen in 2032. And this is really, the methodology we used is quite standard in the industry in terms of looking at levelized costs. So we didn't invent any new methodology. It's the standard methodology that is used, but we used different assumptions and basically similar modeling to what is used also in other regions to make sure that there is comparative or high comparability between our results and other regions. And then because at the moment there's no green electricity in Kuwait because Shagaya is behind schedule, when we looked at, we said, all right, let's look at today. If we look at more of a realistic assumption, we take today's electricity cost, which is based on what Kuwait would be, we think Kuwait is producing renewable energy at 4.7 cents per kilowatt hour. And because production is in 2032, then we can look at electrolyzers cost in 2032 with efficiency levels from that time as well. Then we also said, what about more of a more optimistic scenario? We know, for example, that currently Saudi Arabia was able to produce green electricity at lower costs. And we can say, what about if the price is a little bit lower? And it was the actual price that's currently achieved for electricity, renewable electricity, is lower than this. But this is a way that we can kind of benchmark whether Kuwait would be able to reach that level, and as well something so within the future electrolysis costs. And then finally, we had a hypothetical scenario, which is what if we were to produce hydrogen today in Kuwait? Of course, we can't do that. It's more of a hypothetical scenario, just to look at the competitiveness, whether Kuwait can then produce this at a competitive cost or price, cost actually, relative to other regions. So we looked at today's electrolyzers costs and then today's electricity prices. This is kind of the methodology we did. And I just want to walk you quickly through the results. I won't really describe in details a lot of the technical bits, but basically when we looked at what could the potential cost be producing 1 kilogram of hydrogen, the real cost that is, from the electrolyzers, we come out to about $3.22 US dollars if this is based on electrical power of 450 megawatt. This is, if anyone is really at the technical level to query that. So I put some information here for you on the slide. The price of that is about $3.22 US dollars per kilogram, if again, production in 2032. So this is a realistic assumption that I explained. And then the bigger cost of that is renewable electricity. So this is where we know that if we can reduce the renewable electricity cost, then we'll be able to reduce the production cost per kilogram even further. And then the second one after that then becomes, after that, we really see fixed operating cost of electrolyzers, so electrolyzer cost. And then after that is efficiency of electrolyzers. So this gives us really kind of an idea of what the cost drivers here would be. If we look at the SOC electrolyzer, and this electrolyzer technology is currently not as advanced and not as developed as the PEM electrolyzer, but it looks quite promising for 2030. So we decided let's look at that because this also has quite high efficiency. So that was why we chose SOC electrolyzer technology, but it is more expensive than PEM. And using this technology, the price that we estimated is about $4.41 US dollars per kilogram. But again, more than half of the cost comes from renewable electricity. So again, here, we really, again, seeing reducing renewable electricity costs will drive this price down. And then after that, we also have renewable electricity, electrolyzers cost. We have to remember that electrolyzers cost and renewable cost are going to hit a floor. So at what point, what is that floor? And if we hit that floor, then we won't be able to reduce the production cost per kilogram of hydrogen below that point. So then we have to start thinking as an industry, what would then be other ways that we could even reduce this price even further to make green hydrogen more competitive. This table just to show you an idea again of what does this tell us? How much would we need to reduce the different utilities consumption, for example, or operating capacity factor of the electrolyzers? How much of these changes would we have to reduce to be able to reduce the price per 1 kilogram of hydrogen, and what the floor could be? And it looks like we again are reaching a floor, potentially a floor for PEM with $3 for $0.10 per kilogram. If you remember the price I mentioned, which is 1.5 to 2.5 per kilogram of blue hydrogen today, this price is still not competitive with that blue hydrogen. So this is something to kind of keep in mind. Now, you might say, what are the total results of our full study? remember I said there are different scenarios that we looked at with 2 different models for each technology. The price range that we get anywhere from 2.0 to 3.8 using the different assumptions that I mentioned. Here in this price, I've mentioned a little bit before to you, I showed you the decline of renewable electricity and how that would have an effect on driving down the price of production price per hydrogen. Here we look at what if we reduce the electrolyzers cost. Electrolyzers cost can only bring the production price, the production cost, sorry, by about 15% from 2.8 to 3.32. And if on the SOC electrolyzers, it's by 20%. So the difference between the price of electrolyzers today and what we think it will be in 2032, that only brings the real cost of producing hydrogen per kilogram down to anywhere from 18 to 20%. So then 15 to 20%. So then again, that floor that I mentioned is probably going to be hit because this is potentially not enough then to bring the prices down to a level that currently will be competitive either with blue hydrogen or with fossil fuels. How do these prices compare? Remember, the question we're looking at is, does Kuwait have a comparative advantage in the production of green hydrogen? Then we need to look at how does it compare to other regions in production of green hydrogen as well. Currently, the EU price is anywhere from estimated about 4.13 to 7.09 US dollars per kilogram, obviously significantly higher than the price of that we estimate for production in Kuwait. So there is a comparative advantage vis-a-vis the EU. Australia, there's a study, this is not my analysis, this is a study that was conducted on what this will be using solar power in 2030, so quite comparable to my study, of producing green hydrogen in Australia, and the price is 2.4 to 2.9. So this is here as the future the scenario B is the future price with future electricity price. So Australia looks like potentially also either comparable with, depending on the technology side that we're using, and even Kuwait could, and obviously this would apply to the region, could even produce it even lower. But then, and I think I mentioned earlier, this excludes transportation costs as well in our assessment. This is just the actual production of hydrogen, excluding other products. So there is a comparative advantage here, potentially that could be realized. So this kind of confirms what the IEA table that I showed you earlier, that the Middle East actually has a comparative advantage, particularly in the future. What about, does this compete with blue hydrogen? We know that there is expected parity in 2040, and my analysis looks at up to 2030. And the answer is no. That means that at the moment, if we were just to compete at the current market prices with the absence of carbon taxes, green hydrogen will not compete with blue hydrogen, but it could compete with other green hydrogen with consumers that are only looking for green hydrogen and clean hydrogen. So there potentially could be then 2 different markets that we're looking at, one in which green hydrogen might not compete, but the other one where green hydrogen would be competitive. Then finally, are we competing with fossil fuels? The answer again is no, because the price would have to come down to 1.5, either would have to come down to 1.5 to 2 kilograms per production of hydrogen, 1.5 to $2 per kilogram of hydrogen to be competitive with fossil fuels, which would require significant decline of renewable and electrolyzers, which are currently not achievable, potentially achievable in the future. But this would change if there are higher fossil fuel costs through carbon taxes, for example. So the message from this is the markets matter. This is the second takeaway, is that the markets matter, where we compete matter, and it's not just about the actual potential production costs that we're looking at. Final thing I want to leave you with is, once we have this potentially very low competitive price in Kuwait, what does this mean? Are we actually able to have a comparative advantage? There's a lot more steps that need to be done first. Obviously, Shagaya has to be completed, and the project potentially could expand, because the 15% goal of the installed capacity that Shagaya has is for domestic consumption, and we don't want to take away from that for producing hydrogen. Also, what about the technology side of things? Most countries that are more advanced in hydrogen production and clean hydrogen production tend to spend a lot more on research and development. The Middle East spends very little, which is here in the green with the rest of the world. So then there would be a need for maybe partnering with technology leaders or other private sector leaders to compensate for the low technology spend that Gulf states have. There's also roof decarbonization regulations and frameworks in Kuwait as well as in the region. And these will be important if green hydrogen or blue hydrogen for that matter would be used in the domestic consumption. And then the other thing, remember I mentioned the production supply chain in general, there would, in addition to just producing it, there obviously have to be economic, so profitable, but also reliable infrastructure for transmission and storage of hydrogen and of course, transporting it. How do we make it profitable? Which products do we choose and who do we send it to and how do we export it? And the final part would be what cost and whether there are subsidies to incentivize that production and whether that would be then commercial or not. And this is what I want to kind of leave you with, is to remember that hydrogen, from my study, I think Kuwait does have a potential comparative advantage in producing green hydrogen, assuming Shagaya could be completed on time, or even potentially another renewable park that is established particularly for hydrogen. But also Kuwait faces potentially higher shipping costs in export markets because it doesn't have pipelines. Remember I mentioned electrolyzers and renewable energy would drive the cost, but up to a level that would not compete with blue hydrogen in the current market. So then efficiency role would become really important. And then finally, if we tie that back to the national hydrogen strategy for Kuwait, we need to remember, I mentioned a little bit that there would be trade-off between what we're using of renewable energy for domestic production versus what we need for electricity for producing hydrogen. And does that mean that we're only focusing on the export side or not? And finally, I think there would be real commercial implications on this, because for Kuwait to really realize this potential comparative advantage that it has, it'll have to think about involving the private sector, having the right incentives framework in mind that are also profitable from a fiscal perspective, of course, securing the right technology and infrastructure, and how the role of governments will that be. And then the final main key point here, or takeaway as well, is that even if hydrogen is produced competitively from Kuwait and exported, in and of itself, it is not enough just to be a replacement for the need of the country in economic and energy diversification. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions after this.
Thank you, Dr. Shahabi, for this excellent presentation. And I'm sure there will be many questions regarding the numbers you just showed us and the analysis you come up with. Before we may open the floor for a question, I would like just to ask quick questions. One for Mr. Aliyev regarding to the 10% targeted market share of hydrogen 2030 market. In terms of size, what do you expect the size of hydrogen that represent 10% at that time? And what will be the share between green and blue in your strategy?
Thank you, Dr. Salim. I mean, at the moment in the strategy, there is no really details of what percentage would be blue or green. But if you assume that that 15-20% of the, and it is a 10% in core markets. So it's core markets defined by US, UK, US and Europe and Australia. So I don't have exact number, but that what is a core markets 10%. But in UK it's 1 gigawatt from the T side. So let me just give you a look at the numbers that I have. Just give me a second. So I should have the number here to give you a more exact answer. So at the moment we're expecting is around, we have a hopper of around 0.7 million tons per annum. And the hopper has a potential to grow up to 1.3 million tons per annum. So that's kind of the numbers we're actually looking at the moment.
Thank you. The question to Dr. Shahabi. From the analysis, it shows that even in the best possible scenario, the green hydrogen will be a little bit more expensive than the blue hydrogen, which means there is no crossing point between the cost of production of both hydrogen, especially if the price of electricity take the majority of the cost of production, and we're already reaching the almost close to the ground with respect to levelized cost of electricity. Do you think the improvement of electrolyzers can have a significant impact on the price so that they can reach the grid parity?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I, just commenting on your point about whether there will be costs in the prices between blue and green, I haven't looked at that beyond the point of in 2030, but as I mentioned from at least BP's analysis was in 2040, and I think there will cost at some point, but I do believe that there is, as you mentioned, there's this floor that I mentioned, and as you say, the price of electricity we're not going to be able to produce realistically electricity below a particular point, and this is assuming there's no subsidies involved, because subsidies could mean a different story, right? But just assuming the actual price, and then of course there's electricity, the price of electrolyzers. So technology, then the rate at which technology will expedite rapidly will then bring about the price that will bring the speed at which the electrolyzers price will be brought down. But I also do think that could also potentially hit a potential floor, and I think there needs to be other technological advancements. I mentioned efficiency, and our paper mentions that a little bit. I think that will become really very important in looking at what technological advancements would do to bring the price even further down to where the very cheap electricity prices could bring it down. So I think this is really the advantage here, and the extent to which there is a lot of advancements now, or companies trying to work on advancing the technological side into electrolyzers. The type of electrolyzers will matter, and of course the efficiency in the future, but also whether we will have demand or not, right? So if we know that there will be demand in the future, that could then also expedite a lot of the funding to expedite the technological improvement.
In fact, I look at this point from Kuwait point of view, because for us it will be a good time window. We can say 5 to 10 years, where the blue hydrogen will have competitive advantage over the green hydrogen, although they are both important. But for our oil industry, it will be a good time to develop the hydrogen business within the Kuwait conventional oil sector. Since based on the study, not only the study, even other studies, till 2030, the blue hydrogen will have an advantage, and it will stay cheaper, whether it is gray or blue, whether the carbon capture industry get developed or get delayed as well, because they are both important for Kuwait. Mr. Ali, if you would like to comment on this.
No, I mean, I think Dr. Manal, and you covered everything. I just wanted to actually go back to the question you asked. I did a quick calculation while you were discussing the second question. So if I look from what we say is, demand in 2030, 2035 will be around 100 and 120 million tons per annum. And if I look at what is the China, US, Europe share is around roughly 50%. So I would come up with around 5 to 6 million tons per annum is what 10% of the market share for BP would mean.
This is
Okay,
very
that answers your
specific,
question.
very specific and clear target by PP for the next 10 years. We will move to
Dr.
the
Salim,
questions. Yes.
If I could just add a point to going back to the point of blue and green, I think, yes, you're right about the window for Kuwait in terms of blue hydrogen, but the thing to consider with blue hydrogen would not just be the price that it has compared to green hydrogen production, but also what's the opportunity cost for that? Meaning, are we using oil and gas that could potentially, because this will be the question that decision makers will make in the energy industry as well. Are we using, what's the export value of whatever we'll be using of oil and gas to produce green hydrogen? And that will have to be part of the conversation. And I think parts of this question should not just be a question of economics. It should obviously be a question of economics short and long term, but also if we consider other values, such as what's the value of creating new market and new potential clients of blue hydrogen, even if it costs us more or doesn't generate enough money as oil and gas exports. If we look at it from really the larger side of things, I think that would qualify perhaps a better way of looking at the opportunity cost of blue hydrogen, because if you just put it as the blue hydrogen versus oil and gas exports, I suspect blue hydrogen would lose. But if you look at it at a slightly larger question, especially if we include the carbon capture and the environmental aspect of it, then it becomes a different question. And then the answer might be different, and it might be then worth it to actually look into blue hydrogen.
Yes, in fact, the point in Kuwait, if any intention to produce hydrogen, it will go from syngas or oil residue, not from the rich high economic value oil. It will go for low value oil, and this will increase the chance for extra market venue aside from the conventional business of oil and gas, which will continue for the next 100 years or so. But this will be a new emerging market, and any oil company, whether national or international, they should set a target like what BB said and work based on that, especially if we know Kuwait has no surplus of gas. We are a net import of gas. If there is a chance for hydrogen, it will go from other source of low-cost hydrocarbons. With this, I would like to open the floor for the questions. We have, I think, if I click answer live, we're done. We lost the first question. It is from Mr. Shah. He said, what is the preferred source of CO2 capture in hydrogen? Is it captured from reform flue gas or PSA tail gas? I think the question for Mr. Aliyev.
It will be very difficult for me to answer that question. It's really a technical one. Maybe Dr. Manal has a understanding. I can follow up certainly with the technical people and answer that question.
Okay. Another question from Dr. Ma'moon Halabi. PP started its drive toward green from the 80s and 90s. Can you see the question in front of you, or?
Yes, I can, and I can answer that question.
Can you see it from your screen? If the
yes,
IT help us to show it. Focusing some activities on renewable energy like solar and wind, then they quit in 2000. Over the coming 30 years, same scenarios might happen. What will be your response to this?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to Lord Brown's famous speech in Stanford University. If you haven't watched it, I recommend you watch it. It was called Beyond Petroleum, and I think it was a great vision. But my view at that time, the policies were not there to support. if I just look now, compared 30 years ago, every country or every company pledges to be net zero by, let's say, in the next 2 or 3 decades, by 2030, 2050. Then if I look at the industry, lots of EV charging cars or fuel cell hydrogen cars. So I think, again, as I mentioned in my presentation, policy needs to change for hydrogen as well. But I'm pretty confident that in this service, many things has changed, including the companies and the government's pledge to meet the Paris Agreement targets. I don't know, Dr. Manal, if you have anything to add to this.
Okay, thank you. I noticed there is some questions in the chat, but please, whoever post a question there, if they can repost it in the Q&A session so that we can follow through one screen. Mr. Mannan said, what is typical per ton cost of CO2 capture from hydrogen plant? How much quantity of CO2 will be captured by BP? Can we assume storage unlimited? I don't think there is unlimited storage, but
yeah. So I think also the cost also differs from different country, different field, different reservoir. So there is no unlimited storage, and the storage really depends on availability of feedstock, etc. So as technology improves, costs come down. On T side, as I mentioned, it's around 2 million carbon emissions that we want to capture. But if you look across the world, it will depend on the new hydrogen projects or new countries that we enter. So there is no definite one number that we can provide for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question. Would you like to elaborate on
no, I was just going to add to that. Of course, I fully agree, but it depends on the technology that is used. And this is part of the criticism, perhaps, of blue hydrogen and by some people, is that we don't know how much of the carbon is actually captured, depending on the technology that is produced, but it all qualifies as blue and clean, whether a small percentage or a large percentage of the carbon that's emitted is captured. So it varies by that. And that also there's sometimes not really full, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe it's resistance, perhaps, to really be very transparent about these figures as well.
Yeah, I'm sure the carbon capture and sequestration will be a topic of coming seminar, and we'll cover on that seminar both the conventional carbon capture and sequestration, as well as the turquoise hydrogen, where carbon can be captured as a solid particles, which is much easier to store permanently, but it is still under development technology. I'm sure we'll bring some experts in both topics to be our guest speakers in the next seminar. Dr. Ma'moon again said the projected demand for hydrogen by 2050 is expected to reach around 15 to 18% of total energy demand. During the same period, the growth in total energy demand will probably reach almost 50%. If we assume an annual growth in demand of around 1.5% annually, taking into consideration, it appears that emphasis on carbon capture, utilization and sequestration appears to be more compatible with the world target to reduce CO2 emission than hydrogen. I appreciate comments from both of you. We start with Aliyev.
Yeah, and I think obviously if you look at it, its first preference will be CCUS and the feedstock for carbon capture. Only thing that confused me in the question is says compared to hydrogen. So that wasn't clear to me. But I think it is. CCUS will require key strategies of blue hydrogen CCUS at least in the next 2 decades to come. That will be the key priority.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Shahabi.
Greetings. Dr. Ma'moon. Yes, and of course it is a very, I fully agree with that. I mean, the role, I think hydrogen will definitely have a role, but in and of itself, it's not going to be sufficient to bring the world to, one, it won't be enough to meet global world demand. It's only up to 20% or so, but also by itself, not enough to bring down all the carbon that's emitted that we also need to remove in order to reach at least the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. So I think, but also the problem with CCUS technologies, and while I agree with the comment that Dr. Halabi had mentioned, I think part of the problem with that is it's still, there's so much, the technology is still early, and what we really need, it's still expensive and not fully feasible in some instances. So there's a lot of room there also for technological advancement for CCUS, but we can't also just rely on that. We're going to have to combine that as well with, whether it's efficiency measurements, which by itself is going to be significant to reduce the emissions, and also how can we reduce some of our consumption. I mentioned in Kuwait, for example, I'm in the UK at the moment, but every time I visited Kuwait, whether summer or winter, it was always very cold in every building I entered because the AC was set really high and the thermostat was set at low temperatures. So could we then change consumption patterns as well? So there's things like that I think are also going to be quite important to have basically the two challenges of meeting energy demand, but also the need to make sure that we focus on decarbonizing the world. So this is part of, I think, of the big challenge for sure.
Thank you. A question from Ali Abdulrahim to Dr. Shihabi. Was the water cost for green hydrogen production from Kuwait's Shagaya project, PV electrolyzer, included? In a recent study, 1 kilogram of green hydrogen required 9 kilograms of water. Green hydrogen could potentially further complicate the energy-water nexus dilemma, especially in water-scarce countries like Kuwait.
Yeah, this is a very good question because there's also, I'll start with the second part of the question about the water energy nexus, because as you know, part of the problem is water, there's very limited fresh water in Kuwait. Most of it is desalinated already using energy. So that complicates the situation. But then we did not take extra, and also with the desalination, there's obviously technologies that can use for green hydrogen that can use salty water as well. And then the question then becomes, what do you do with the water that you desalinated with the brine and all that? There's quite complications that we've mentioned but haven't taken in the analysis at the moment. So but then in terms of the water, there was a cost of the water that is used in the process, but not any extra additional water that we included. But then the subsequent cost of that as well is, what do you do with, once you take the water that's desalinated, we just assume it's desalinated rather than take an extra cost to desalinate, or what will we do with the brine that's produced, for example, that we didn't consider at this stage. But that is also an issue that Kuwait will have to face, whether or not it proceeds with hydrogen production. Just with continuing the desalination process is going to be an issue. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll go for the next question, Mr. Shah. Apart from production cost, how much will be the transportation cost, including ammonia production and conversion back to hydrogen? This is added costs as we move.
I assume that's for me.
Yes.
I think it depends. It depends on where we're obviously shipping it to, and what path or what routes we're taking. So I suspect the costs, I don't have the actual value right this moment on top of my head, because it also depends on where the shipping is from and where the location is. But we know that in Kuwait, it's going to be a higher shipping cost than in other parts of the world because there's no pipelines. So then this is where ammonia, the question mentions ammonia, this is where ammonia makes sense, because then you can ship the ammonia in itself and then crack it at source, or not source, at destination. And then the price for that, I think I don't have the number in my study. We didn't look at that number in particular. We didn't, I think I did mention we excluded transportation and storage costs as well, and also other products like, you know, oxygen or other things. But the whether, let me look back at the question, could my production cover about testing? I think maybe because I don't have the number, what I would maybe answer this with a qualitative perspective is whether there would be a comparative advantage in green hydrogen if it is transported. And I think from Kuwait, it might not be, perhaps a comparative advantage would be if it's transported in ammonia and then converted back to, or cracked back, as you call it, back to hydrogen. But that wouldn't be the largest, that's probably the most efficient way of producing it or transporting it out of Kuwait. But I don't have the number. I think it's definitely going to depend also if you're shipping it to Europe or if you're shipping it to Japan. That's also going to depend on the destination as well.
Thank you. I think the cost will be variable. Of course, if you produce and consume domestically, it will be much cheaper than producing it and export it to another country for end use. So the cost will add up as the utilization distances get farther. Mr. Justin Alexander, I think he's talking to you, Dr. Shihab. Excellent study. How big a risk is it that motivates the local green hydrogen production in consuming countries, energy security and green job creation? Could override the Gulf's production cost advantage for greater solar efficiency and lower land cost? Exactly the same as the discussion we just concluded. So if you can comment.
So if I understood the question correctly, thank you for the feedback on the study. How big a risk is the motivation for local green hydrogen production? Okay, I think personally the motivation, I think the question says energy security and green job creation. Indeed, I think energy security is a motivation, but not as energy security in the domestic market. I believe, this is my analysis, that the biggest motivation is not really for domestic energy security, but it's really security in the export market. Instead of having a dwindling or a smaller share of oil and gas exports, then Gulf states are thinking, let's also then become energy exporters, not just oil and gas exporters. And I think this is the motivation, but I do agree that there is a risk. I don't think that there will be a lot of green job creation, to be honest. I think that generally, we've seen this in general with, these are very technological and capital-based industries. So the job creation is not going to be very large, and the focus is on the export market. And I do think there is a risk because it's going to potentially continue to generate export revenue, but there's not going to be really a focus on decarbonization of the domestic industries, whether it's from expanding renewable energy locally, or whether it is from using hydrogen or other products domestically. And this also, if we add subsidies, then that can potentially complicate other things. And then I do think that, let me read that, make sure that I haven't missed any part of the question. Advantages from greater solar efficiency. Yes, I do think that if oil and gas usage for domestic production or domestic usage in general is largely subsidized and also largely cheaper than renewables, then yes, there is this risk that there will not be, we're not really taking advantage of the large wind and solar, particularly solar resources that we have, which could really extend the life of hydrocarbons, but also achieve decarbonization for much longer. So yes, indeed, there is definitely a risk. And this is why I really believe, and I've advocated for this in other studies, that I think energy policy in the Gulf should really looked at as more of a larger sense of sustainability and economy and the environment, not just energy and oil and gas exports. It needs to be kind of a larger examination of all of these together.
Thank you, Dr. Manal. In addition to what you just mentioned, I think for countries like GCC countries, where their fiscal budget to very large extent depend on sale of oil, what we call the single source of economy, this is by itself is a risk. And if country like Kuwait invest more in green energy, especially from renewable, this will be a source of economic growth away from the oil industry. And this will definitely add to the GDP, a source of income that is not conventional, and to de-risk the dependency on oil revenue. Mr. Wael asked also Dr. Shihab, thank you for your information. I have a couple of questions. Number one, what is the assumed efficiency of electrolyzers used in your model, and what is the capacity factor of REN source in Shigaya? Renewable energy and implies of what, I don't know. The second question, why Kuwait needs to explore the hydrogen potential, in which sectors Kuwait will use it, especially Kuwait already invest in heavily in gas import infrastructure to use imported gas for electricity and industrial sectors, mainly petrochemicals. I think we are moving on the same circle. So please, Manal.
Thank you for the feedback and the good questions. For the second question, I would recommend that perhaps you read the white paper on hydrogen strategy for finding out what the potential usage of that could be, because I think your question isn't what I would think it should be, but your question is what does Kuwait intend? And so I will leave that to policymakers potentially to address it. But I also think it's a white strategy, it's a white paper, so it still didn't have full detailed from memory when I reviewed it, but that is potentially out of my scope to address or answer that question. In terms of the first question, so the paper, I would really invite you to have a look at the paper, because it has details of all these technical questions, and the paper, we published it at the International Association of Energy Economics. And if you shoot me a message here on the board, I can actually probably share it with everybody. But just to give you the efficiency values that we use for the electrolyzers, were basically, there were studies on what the efficiency would be over time. So in 2030 of the different expected electrolyzers. So we use that, and that is in a particular table in the study. And then in terms of the operating capacity factors for PEM, apologize for everyone else if this is too technical, it was 97%, and then for SOEC 87.5%, and that was basically based on a recommended technology standard that we use. So with some of our assumptions were based on what exactly is the standard in the industry, rather than our assumptions. So I think that answers both questions, and I'll just post the link to the paper now if you would like to see more details, and obviously free to reach out afterwards if you have any more questions on the paper, and I'll post it shortly.
Thank you, Dr. Manal. A question from Dr. Samir Qut said, why not quoting the cost of hydrogen in terms of dollar per metric million BTU instead of dollar per kilogram of hydrogen? Then what is the typical CO2 emission per kilogram of blue hydrogen? Mr. Aliyev?
I think it's around 7 to 9 kilograms. But you know, why
it's from natural gas?
Yeah,
if the feedstock natural gas, because it depends on the feedstock.
But on the measurement, you know, I think it's just the way people get used to, whether it's you know, it's very difficult to comment on that one. So it's just really how people prefer to measure it.
Mm-hmm. Any comments on the units? Because I see many units in different reports referring to the hydrogen.
Yeah.
Tons, kilograms, BTU. Mr. Shahabi, Dr. Shahabi, no comment on this?
I think it's a standard. I mean, if anyone for all people who work in energy, we know that conversion can become really a pain and a difficult thing to use. And I think why is that price used? That's a very good question. I think it's an industry standard, and I don't know why it is. But I suspect in part because we usually look at things in 1 unit of usage. With 1 barrel of of oil, for example, and in this case, oil in hydrogen, it will be condensed to 1 kilogram. But I don't know why there are other, but yes, you can convert it others as well and make a price, but that seems to be the price of the industry. And I suspect this is the price at which is also gray and brown, well, non-clean hydrogen, let me say, already is being priced at that as well. So.
Thank you. The following question from Mr. Abdulrahman. We know that hydrogen is expensive to store because it needs to be stored under high pressure or low temperature. Is this cost added to the total cost of production, or it is separated in your study, I guess?
In my study, no, it is separate. We did not look at cost of transmission or cost of storage. We just looked at the cost of the actual production, in the sense to try, because everybody has a cost of the transmission, as we mentioned earlier, and the transportation varies significantly between where it is and in what product or derivative it is in, and what the destination would be. But then any producer will have to think of how to have the safety measures and how to compress it and how to store it. So that is pretty much a cost for everyone that is quite common. But what is not common is the cost of what the renewable electricity will be and what the cost of electrolyzer will be and other things. So we excluded that, and we just looked at the actual price in itself. Now, if this were to be a price that BP, for example, is looking at, or the government of Kuwait is looking at, they will have to think of the different assessments and different views of where, because as I mentioned, the destination, for example, will change that cost. So these, if you want to think of it as maybe more like a fixed cost of production, and then more, even though that fixed cost of production has operating costs within it, not just fixed costs, and then you can have other operating or changeable variable costs such as destination, transportation, etc. So we just looked at the production cost, and I hope that kind of clarifies it, because I've seen also a few other questions on that same point.
Thank you, Dr. Manal. Unfortunately, we will have no time to go over about 6 or 7 questions being placed in the chat section. During the Q&A session, we're always looking at the Q&A section. So unfortunately, we are running out of time to go over them. We'll take the last question from this seminar from Mr. Khalid Kaswani. If the cost will be above $2.5 in both methods, what will be the benefits of investing in this? Although CO2 is important, but finance are also important. I think this is for the green hydrogen by 2032. 2032.
I'll invite also Mr. Aliyev to add anything he wants to add after that, because the important thing here is obviously when we think of why we're looking at hydrogen in general and green in general, it's not just the cost that is a value. There's all these what we in economics call externalities, right? What is the cost of CO2, for example, and what's the cost of that on the environment and the global warming and climate change, and then it becomes a long list. And there is this large trend in the world of also going towards clean and energy and the energy transition. So I mentioned briefly in my presentation that there is 2 markets. There's a market that is just competing on cost, and then there's a market that is competing in clean energy. And so I think there's still a big benefit, even if the price is over 2.5, because there is still demand for clean energy. And I think we as a world need to really invest heavily in cleaner energy sources, rather than just think what is the monetary value that we get out of that. So I think the benefit of that will also be that there is a share of the whether it's in domestic energy usage for decarbonization purposes or export market, Kuwait can still have a share of that market in green. You know, I think we need to start thinking about what's the larger benefit to, you know, our lives and the climate and the world and our children when it comes to why we need to think of clean energy. So this question is more on what's the benefit of the energy transition, I think, in general. So that's where, and that's where also there would be more benefit in trying to reduce the price or the cost of production down so that it becomes more profitable, not only good for the environment. Mr. Aliyev, do you have any other comments?
No, I'm good.
Thank you. There is one more question came I can't ignore because it talks about turquoise hydrogen. My preferred topic, it is also, it's an emerging technology. We have a few pilot projects in Europe and North America, but I believe it is more sustainable and permanent method of storing carbon in its solid form. But I'd like you to comment, both of you, in fact, on the methane pyrolysis, if you ever came across it.
I have not, certainly. Maybe Dr. Manal.
Okay.
Not so much in green, in blue, but not so much in green.
Yeah, it is in green. There is no carbon at all. But
yeah, but
in blue,
the question
yeah.
says.
Methane pyrolysis
Sorry,
is blue.
sorry, I read the question wrong. It says compared to green. Oh, I see. I thought it meant in green. Okay, that makes sense. I don't have numbers actually on the profitability of methane pyrolysis, although I do know that it's a coming up technology, and then there is ways of doing it potentially cheaper than other existing technologies. So I wouldn't necessarily ignore it at the moment. And I know of a couple of examples. The information is not, unfortunately, it's a bit confidential that I can't share the details of their study, but there's some work in that. Now, the profitability, I think, remains still a question among, but as far as I know, it's not the main technology used for blue, of course, but it's not a technology to be ignored in any time soon. It's upcoming, and yeah, and there are some investments in it.
It is a promising. It left the research bench and it is in the pilot stage. I think
Commercialization stage, right?
In commercialization, probably few pilot plants already in operation and on the expansion phase. But this will be part of our topic in the next seminar, which will be dedicated for carbon capture. With this, I am sorry again for those who placed their questions in the chat corner, because I can't see them properly. But hopefully we can find the chance in the near future to answer them. Thank you very much for your audience, our audience, and thank you for our speakers for your patience and your level of details that let the 1.5 hour pass without feeling. Thank you and have a great night.